The sun blazed overhead, pouring golden light across the neighborhood. For me, those rays weren't just warmth, they were power. My solar panels, installed across my roof, were more than just an investment. They were my pride, my independence, my way of telling the HOA that I didn't need their overpriced electricity bills. But the Karen sisters, those self-proclaimed rulers of the HOA, saw my panels as a challenge to their authority. They despised how the panels gleamed brighter than their opinions, hated how neighbors admired the sleek design, and loathed that I wasn't under their thumb. One afternoon while I was at work, they struck with ladders, tools, and their sharp voices. They climbed onto my roof like vandals in the daylight, smashing the panels to pieces. By the time I came home, shards of glass sparkled in the driveway like fallen stars, my hard-earned freedom destroyed. The neighborhood whispered. Cameras caught their chaos. And while they thought they had one thought I would crawl back and beg for their HOA electricity, I simply smiled. Because what the Karen sisters didn't know was that I wasn't just a homeowner. I was also the systems manager for the HOA's private power grid. Every house, every bulb, every air conditioner, they all ran through the systems I maintained. They believed they had the power, but in truth, I was the one who held the switch. So when the Karens mocked me at the next HOA meeting, flaunting their control and daring me to fight back, I decided if they wanted a war over power, I'd give them one. And I wouldn't swing a single hammer. I'd use the sun, the wires, and the grid itself to remind them exactly who controlled the neighborhood. Asterisk, the morning started the same way it always did in my quiet neighborhood. The sun climbed over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the neat lawns and polished driveways. Birds sang in the trees, sprinklers clicked on, and the air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass. But for me, mornings weren't just about coffee and routine. They were about checking the panels on my roof to sleek, shining solar panels that I had saved for, invested in, and cherished. I walked outside with my mug in hand, tilting my head up to admire them like I always did. The way they caught the light made me proud, not just proud of the money I was saving, but proud of what they represented: independence, freedom from the ridiculous electricity bills that the HOA forced onto everyone. I was no longer chained to their monopoly, no longer at their mercy. Every beam of sunlight was mine, converted into power that fueled my home. But of course, not everyone saw it that way. The Karen sisters, Margaret and Diane, had made it their personal mission to destroy anything they couldn't control. They weren't just neighbors, they were the self-proclaimed queens of the HOA. Their word was law, or at least that's what they believed. They spent their days patrolling the streets with clipboards, pointing out uncut grass, mismatched paint, or trash cans left a minute too long on the curb. The neighborhood both feared and despised them, but no one dared to challenge them. No one but me. The sisters hated my solar panels from the very first day they were installed. They ruined the look of the neighborhood. Margaret had snapped, standing in my driveway with her hands on her hips. Diane chimed in with, "You'll bring down property values with those ugly black squares." I ignored them, of course, because I had every legal right to install them. But ignoring a Karen is like throwing gasoline on a fire. They burned hotter with every refusal, every dismissal. I should have known they wouldn't stop at words. That afternoon, while I was at work, the attack came. My phone buzzed with a notification from my security cameras, but I was stuck in a meeting and couldn't check it. By the time I drove home, the damage had already been done. I turned the corner into my street and froze. Shards of broken glass glittered on my driveway like crushed diamonds. My beautiful panels, were in ruins. Frames bent, surfaces shattered, wires dangling like veins ripped from the roof. I dropped my coffee cup, still half full, onto the ground. My stomach twisted with shock and anger. For a long moment I just stood there, staring, unable to believe what I was seeing. It wasn't vandalism done in the shadows of night, it was destruction in broad daylight. Then I saw the camera footage. The video showed them clearly, the Karen sisters, climbing ladders with tools in hand, their voices shrill as they shouted at each other. They stomped across my roof, laughing and sneering as they pried, smashed, and ripped. They didn't even try to hide their faces. When the panels fell, crashing onto the driveway, they clapped like children at a circus. And then they left, walking away with smug satisfaction, as if they had just done a public service. My hands shook as I watched. I replayed the clip 3, 4, 5 times, my anger growing with every second they had crossed the line. This wasn't a petty HOA fine or a nasty letter in the mailbox. This was destruction of property, an attack on something I had worked for, something that mattered to me. Neighbors slowly wandered out of their houses as word spread. Some stood in small groups across the street, whispering. A few offered sympathetic looks, but no one dared confront the sisters. The Karens themselves were sitting on their porch, sipping iced tea like villains celebrating a victory. When our eyes met, Margaret raised her glass and smirked. I wanted to storm across the street, to shout, to demand answers. My fists clenched at my sides, but I didn't move, because deep down, I realized something. Yelling at them would change nothing. Calling the police, maybe, but the Karens always had tricks, excuses, and friends in the HOA who twisted rules in their favor. They had won battles before with noise and drama. But this time was different. I wasn't just a homeowner. I wasn't just some guy with solar panels. I was the systems manager for the HOA's private power grid. The entire neighborhood's flicker of light, every worry, air conditioner, every appliance flowed through systems that I maintained, monitored, and controlled. The Karens thought they had the power, but the truth was, I was the one holding the switch that as I swept up the broken glass from my driveway, their laughter echoing across the street, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about money or property anymore. It was about control. They had tried to take mine away, but in doing so they had handed me the perfect weapon. That night, I sat at my computer staring at the grid's control panel. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes. One command, one simple reroute, and their houses would flicker into silence. No lights, no air conditioning, no endless pool heating, no refrigerators humming, just darkness. But I didn't press the key. Not yet. Revenge wasn't something to rush. It wasn't a hammer swung in rage. It was patience. It was strategy. It was letting them believe they had one, all while preparing the ground to show them who truly ruled this neighborhood. When I finally stood up from my desk, the plan was already forming. The sisters had destroyed my panels, but they had no idea what they had awakened. They thought they were safe behind their HOA power, but soon they would learn the truth. Power wasn't in meetings, clipboards, or iced tea smiles. Power was in the grid, and I controlled it. 2 days had passed since the destruction of my solar panels, and I still hadn't spoken a single word to the Karen sisters. Not one. That was the part that seemed to bother them the most. Normally, when they attacked someone, the target would blow up, argue back, or at the very least beg the HOA for mercy, but I hadn't given them that satisfaction. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. I didn't even look angry when I saw them across the street. I just swept up the glass, salvaged what pieces I could, and carried on. But inside, I was planning. My work as systems manager for the HOA's power grid gave me a unique perspective. Every house in the neighborhood showed up as a line on my monitoring system, a constant dance of kilowatts, surges, and demands. Most people used power modestly, their graphs spiking only when the dishwasher ran or the air conditioner kicked in. But the Karen sisters, their houses stood out like bonfires in the night. Their consumption was enormous, greedy, wasteful. Margaret ran her air conditioning day and night, even when the weather was mild. Diane had a pool heater that guzzled electricity like a monster with an endless thirst. Add in there 3 fridges, countless decorative lights, and appliances running around the clock, and it was obvious they were addicted to power. The irony wasn't lost on me. They craved control, yet they were the most dependent of us all. On the third evening, I sat on my porch as the sun dipped low, watching them parade around with their clipboards. They harassed one neighbor about a lawn that wasn't cut to regulation height. They scolded another for leaving a garden hose coiled in the wrong spot. Each encounter ended the same way, with neighbors nodding, apologizing, and shrinking back into their homes. The sisters laughed loudly, like hyenas that had just claimed another kill. I sipped my coffee and let the warmth calm me, though every part of me ached to act. My neighbors deserved freedom from these tyrants, just as I deserved justice from my panels. I had the tools. I had the access. What I needed now was timing. The first opportunity came sooner than I expected. That weekend, the HOA hosted a mandatory neighborhood social gathering. The sisters called it a barbecue, but it was more like a parade of their authority. They set up tables, decorations, and speakers in the park, demanding that every family bring food and stay the full 3 hours. Missing the event meant a fine. Not attending long enough meant another fine. Everyone knew the rules, and everyone hated it. I showed up with a bowl of pasta salad, setting it on the long table. Margaret and Diane were already there, dressed in matching floral dresses, their hair sprayed into perfect helmets. They were like royalty presiding over a court, greeting some with fake smiles and glaring at others with icy disdain. When they saw me, their expressions brightened in mockery. "Oh look, it's Mr. Solar Panels," Margaret announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "How's the roof still shiny?" Diane giggled, covering her mouth with exaggerated grace. "Maybe next time you'll ask the HOA before putting up something so distracting." A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between us. No one spoke up. They never did. The sisters ruled through fear, and fear silenced them all. I didn't take the bait. I simply smiled, nodded politely, and walked away. That seemed to irritate them more than if I had shouted back. Later that night, after the gathering ended and the park emptied, I sat in front of my laptop with the system's dashboard glowing in front of me. I stared at the sisters' consumption graphs, watching the jagged lines climb higher and higher as their appliances roared. Their pool heater alone was pulling enough power to light 3 houses. It would have been so easy to cut them off entirely. One command, one keystroke, and their homes would go dark. But that wasn't the plan. A sudden blackout would make them suspicious, maybe even point fingers at me. What I needed was subtlety. Enough disruption to frustrate them, but not enough to reveal I was behind it, so I started small. I adjusted the voltage just slightly, enough to cause flickers but not failures. Lights dimmed and brightened unpredictably. Fans slowed down, then sped back up. Their televisions cut to static for seconds at a time before resuming. Appliances hummed louder, strained, as if the house itself were groaning under pressure. Across the streets I could see the effects almost immediately. Margaret stormed out onto the porch, waving her arms in frustration. Diane followed, shouting something about the cheap HOA grid and how she was going to call someone to fix it. They ran back inside, only for the lights to flicker again. From my porch, I sipped another cup of coffee, savoring the sight. The next morning, electricians showed up at their house. The sisters paced nervously while workers checked every wire, every breaker, but of course they found nothing wrong. By noon, the Karens were red-faced and furious. I knew this because I overheard them berating the poor men in their driveway, insisting that someone must be sabotaging us. They weren't wrong. For the next 2 days I kept the disturbances subtle but constant. Their appliances never failed, completely, but they never worked smoothly either. The air conditioners rattled and sputtered, sometimes turning off for no reason. Their fridges made loud clicking noises, sending them into a panic about spoiled food. The pool heater barely warmed the water, leaving their carefully curated backyard party plans in jeopardy. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood carried on in perfect comfort. Lights shone steady, fans whirred smoothly, and air conditioners purred along without issue. It didn't take long for people to notice the contrast. Why do only their houses have problems? One neighbor whispered to another as we crossed paths on the sidewalk. Probably karma. Another replied with a grin. For the first time in years, the sisters weren't being feared. They were being laughed at, and that, I realized, was the sweetest part of all this. Not just revenge, but exposure. I wasn't just punishing them quietly, I was showing the entire neighborhood how fragile their so-called power really was. By the end of the week, the sisters were unraveling. They argued in their driveway, their voices sharp enough to carry across the street. Margaret demanded that the HOA hire new electricians. Diane screamed that she couldn't host another party until the issues were fixed. They blamed the weather, faulty equipment, even bad energy in the neighborhood, but not once did they suspect me. That night, as I sat by the window watching their lights flicker again, I knew this was only the beginning. I had more tools at my disposal, more tricks hidden in the grid. What they had done to my solar panels had been physical, brutal, and childish. But my revenge would be elegant, invisible, and unstoppable. And the best part, they would never see it coming. By the second week, the Karen sisters' frustration had boiled into chaos. Their houses had become the only dark spots in a neighborhood otherwise glowing with calm, reliable power. Neighbors were noticing more openly now, their whispers turning into smirks, their smirks into quiet laughter, and the sisters who once strutted through the streets with their clipboards in smug confidence were beginning to unravel. From my porch, I could see their frustration play out like a show. Margaret would storm outside in the evenings, shouting into her phone at yet another electrician or some unlucky HOA contact. Diane followed close behind, clutching her glass of wine like a lifeline, yelling about how this neighborhood is falling apart and how she won't live like this another day. Their lights flickered, their air conditioning stuttered, and their pool remained stubbornly cold. And every night, when the rest of us sat in cool comfort under steady light, they stewed in their own sweat. I had become patient with my plan, careful with my execution. At first it had been little flickers and hums. Now, I started tightening the screws. I timed the disruptions perfectly. Just as they sat down for dinner, the lights dimmed right when their television shows reached a climax. The screen cut to static. When their pool parties began, the heater sputtered and shut off, leaving guests shivering in lukewarm water. It wasn't sabotage, they could prove it was frustration, designed to eat away at them piece by piece. But the beauty of it all wasn't just their suffering, it was the shift in the neighborhood. People had grown so used to living under the Karen's rules that they'd forgotten what freedom felt like. Now, watching the sisters stumble, they were remembering one evening as I walked down the block. My neighbor Alex fell into step beside me. He was usually a quiet man, always avoiding conflict. But today his grin was wide. "You seen what's happening to them?" he asked, lowering his voice like it was a secret. "Hard not to," I replied. He chuckled. "About time, huh? Feels good, doesn't it? Seeing them get a taste of their own medicine." I didn't answer directly, just gave him a knowing smile. But inside I felt the satisfaction bloom. The fear that once shielded the Karens was crumbling, and the neighborhood was starting to see them not as queens, but as fools. The sisters, of course, didn't take it quietly. At the next HOA meeting, they launched into their performance. "This grid is a disgrace," Margaret thundered, slamming her hand against the table. "We demand an immediate overhaul. Someone is sabotaging us." Diane chimed in, her voice sharp and shrill. "We pay for perfection, not this circus. Whoever is responsible will pay dearly." The room was silent, but not in the way it used to be. Before, neighbors would sit in fearful silence, avoiding eye contact, terrified of becoming the sisters' next target. Now, the silence was different. It was heavy with suppressed laughter, with shared amusement. Some even glanced at each other, Grinning behind their hands, I sat at the far end of the table, calm and quiet. "The grid is fine," I said evenly, tapping the reports in front of me. "No problems have been detected. Every house is receiving stable service. Every house." Diane snapped, her eyes narrowing. "Yes," I said smoothly, letting the word hang. "Every house." Their faces twisted with frustration. For the first time, they weren't being obeyed. They weren't being feared. They were being doubted. That night, as I adjusted their voltage once again, I realized something important. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about shifting power in the neighborhood itself. The Karens had thrived because people were too afraid to fight back. But now the cracks were showing. Their control was slipping, and I was helping pry it loose. The next disruption was one of my favorites. The sisters had planned a small exclusive dinner party with a few of their allies and the HOA people they used to keep on their side, with favors and intimidation. From my laptop, I waited until their guests arrived, until the house was full of laughter and clinking glasses. Then I struck. First, the lights dimmed to a faint glow. The air conditioner cut out, leaving the house to grow stuffy. Their sound system began to crackle and distort, turning music into a garbled mess. Finally, the oven shut off mid-bake, leaving their carefully prepared roast half-cooked from my window. I watched as their guests began filing out early, fanning themselves in the heat, muttering about how unfortunate it was. Margaret stood on the porch, red-faced and sweating, while Diane begged people to stay, but no one did. By the end of the night, they were left alone, furious and humiliated. The next morning, the whispers in the neighborhood grew louder. "Did you hear their dinner was ruined? Guess all their money can't keep the lights on." About time karma came for them. I walked past groups of neighbors exchanging stories, their voices light with amusement. Where once people spoke of the Karens in fear, now they spoke of them as a joke. It was a small revolution, quiet but powerful, and it was spreading. By the end of the week, even their most loyal allies were pulling away. Without the dinners, the parties, the displays of power, the sisters had little left to offer. Their influence was built on control, and with every flicker of their lights, that control slipped further from their grasp. But they weren't done fighting. Oh no, they were Karens to the core, and Karens never surrendered quietly. I could see the storm building in their eyes as they marched through the neighborhood barking orders no one followed. They were planning something, I could feel it, and that was fine by me, because I had plans of my own. I sat on my porch that night, the hum of my newly repaired solar panels steady and strong above me. The golden light of the setting sun reflected off them like a promise. The sisters had tried to destroy my independence, but instead, they had given me something far greater. They had given me power. Real power. Not the kind written in HOA bylaws or enforced with fines. The kind that could dim their lights, silence their televisions, and spoil their food. The kind that could make them sweat in the dark while the rest of us lived comfortably. And the best part, they still had no idea who was behind it. I leaned back in my chair, smiling to myself as their porch light flickered again. The neighborhood was waking up. The Karens were crumbling, and this was only the beginning. The Karen sisters were many things: loud, entitled, vindictive, but one thing they weren't was quitters. Even as their lights flickered, their fridges clattered, and their neighborhood kingdom slipped through their fingers, I could see the stubborn fire in their eyes. They weren't going to surrender to humiliation. They were going to fight back, and they started with me. One morning I stepped outside to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. HOA violation, unauthorized solar installation. Beneath it was a list of supposed infractions, everything from visual disruption of neighborhood aesthetics to safety hazard for roof integrity. At the bottom, in bold letters, was the demand: remove all panels within 7 days or face escalating fines. I couldn't help but laugh. My solar panels were already approved by county law, installed by certified professionals, and protected by state energy rights. The HOA had no legal ground to force me to remove them. But legality never mattered to the Karens. Power did. This was their way of saying, "We know it's you, we can't prove it, but we'll break you another way." That evening at the HOA meeting, they put on their usual performance. Margaret rose dramatically from her chair, holding up pictures of my roof as if she were presenting evidence of a crime. "These panels are an eyesore," she declared, her voice sharp enough to cut through the room. "We've received multiple complaints from concerned residents." Diane followed, waving the violation notice like a flag. "If we allow this, what's next? Neon lights, satellite dishes. We must preserve the beauty of our neighborhood." The neighbors shifted in their seats, but this time the silence wasn't submission, it was discomfort. People exchanged looks, rolled their eyes, even muttered under their breaths. They were tired of the sisters' crusades. I sat quietly, letting the tension build, until finally one brave soul, Mrs. Patel from down the street, spoke up. "His panels don't bother anyone," she said firmly. "They save energy. Maybe more of us should have them." The sisters froze, their mouths snapping shut for the first time in memory. Margaret's face flushed red. Diane sputtered, searching for words, but the room had shifted. The fear was gone. In its place was something new. defiance. I leaned back in my chair, hiding a smile. My neighbors were finding their voices. The sisters' power was slipping faster than even I had hoped. But cornered animals lash out the hardest. The very next day, they escalated. While I was at work, they called in a roofing inspector, one of their friends in the industry, to claim my panels were improperly secured. The man left another bright notice on my door, warning of roof damage risk. Later, a city official showed up, clearly dragged out by their complaints, though he left quickly after reviewing my paperwork and finding nothing wrong. That evening, they stood across the street, arms crossed, watching me like vultures circling a wounded animal. Their message was clear: we're not done with you. And neither was I that night. I opened the grid controls with a new determination. The subtle flickers and disruptions had done their job, but it was time to push harder. The sisters had crossed into open war, and I had no reason to hold back. I didn't cut their power completely again, too obvious. Instead, I introduced chaos. Their voltage spiked just enough to trip breakers randomly, plunging their houses into sudden blackouts that forced them to fumble with flashlights. Their garage doors jammed, trapping their SUVs inside. Their alarm systems triggered false alerts at 3 in the morning, blaring sirens into the night. The neighborhood, meanwhile, slept soundly. It was beautiful. By the second day, the sisters were unraveling. Margaret marched through the streets yelling about sabotage and targeted harassment. Diane filed yet another complaint with the HOA, this time demanding a full neighborhood inspection. But the more they ranted, the less people cared. Neighbors who once cowered now rolled their eyes, muttering under their breath. Children giggled as they watched the sisters stomp around in fury. I wasn't the only one enjoying it. Alex caught me outside one afternoon and smirked. "Whatever's happening to them," he said quietly, "don't stop. This neighborhood's but miserable for years because of those two. You're giving us all a little peace." Peace, that word stuck with me, because that's what it felt like. For the first time since I'd moved here, people were smiling. Lawns grew a little freer, decorations popped up without fear of fines, and the air felt lighter. It wasn't just revenge anymore, it was liberation. But the sisters weren't ready to accept defeat. Late that week, I came home to find them waiting in my driveway. Margaret stood tall, her arms crossed, while Diane held a thick folder stuffed with papers. "You think you're clever," Margaret hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "But we know it's you." Diane stepped forward, shoving the folder at me. "We have every complaint, every violation, every piece of evidence we need. You'll regret this." I looked down at the folder, then back up at their furious faces. Behind them, their porch light flickered once again, sputtering before going dark. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Neighbors across the street chuckled, pointing as the sisters spun around in rage. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply smiled, picked up the folder, and set it gently on the hood of my car. "Funny thing about power," I said calmly, my voice steady. "It's only real if people believe you have it." Their eyes widened, but I turned and walked inside without another word. That night, I sat by my laptop long after midnight, watching the graphs on the screen. Their houses glowed with instability, every spike and dip a reminder of who truly controlled the neighborhood now. My solar panels hummed quietly on the roof, pulling in the steady energy of the sun. The sisters wanted war, and I had given it to them, but unlike their battles, loud, messy, and fueled by ego, mine was silent, invisible, and absolute. For the first time since they had smashed my panels, I felt not just satisfaction but certainty. They could file complaints, scream at meetings, call in inspectors and officials. None of it mattered, because when night fell and their houses plunged into chaos once more, they were reminded of the truth. The HOA didn't control the power. I did. And as their empire crumbled one flicker at a time, I knew one thing for certain: the endgame was near. The sisters' desperation grew like a storm cloud ready to burst. They had tried intimidation. They had tried inspectors, violations, and even threats right to my face. None of it worked. With each passing day, their control slipped further, and their anger consumed them. They had built their entire identity around being untouchable, unchallengeable queens of the neighborhood, and now they were powerless literally. The final unraveling began on a Friday night. The sisters had organized one last event to prove they still had authority, a mandatory neighborhood block party. Flyers were stuffed into every mailbox with bold, underlined words: attendance required. Absences will result in fines. They even decorated the park with lights, banners, and speakers, determined to show everyone they still reigned supreme, but fate, or rather, my laptop had other plans. I waited until the party was in full swing, until the music played and the sisters. We stood on stage with microphones, attempting to rally the neighbors. Their voices carried through the night air, sharp and commanding, ordering everyone to stay, to smile, to obey. People stood awkwardly in small groups, plates of food in their hands, their patience thinning. I could feel the resentment bubbling just beneath the surface, and that's when I acted. From my phone, I tapped into the grid controls. The speakers cut out mid-sentence, silencing Diane's shrill command. The stage lights flickered, sputtered, and then went dark, plunging the sisters into shadow. For a brief moment, the park was still. Then, across the street, their houses fully decorated with string lights and electric displays erupted into chaos. Lights flashed on and off like a broken carnival. Appliances roared and shut down. Alarms screamed, and their sprinklers suddenly burst to life, drenching the carefully decorated stage. The crowd gasped. Some tried to stifle their laughter, but within seconds, chuckles spread through the park. Then came the open laughter reel, free, unrestrained. The Karens stood on the stage, soaked and stunned, their microphones sparking in their hands. Their carefully planned night had collapsed into a humiliating spectacle. Margaret shrieked, "This is sabotage. We're being attacked." Diane screamed, "You'll all regret this. You'll regret laughing at us." But no one listened. Number one obeyed. The neighbors who had lived under their control for years finally saw them for what they were: powerless, ridiculous, and beaten. The fear that had once silenced the community was gone, replaced with something stronger: solidarity. People shook their heads, muttered things like, "Enough is enough," and walked away. One by one, families left the park, abandoning the sisters to their chaos. By the time the last neighbor disappeared, the Karens were alone on their ruined stage, dripping wet and screaming at the empty night. I stood at the edge of the park, watching quietly. I didn't need to gloat, didn't need to say a word. My work was done. They had destroyed themselves with their arrogance. I had simply nudged the dominoes. The next morning, the sisters tried to recover. They sent out angry emails filled with threats, demanded emergency HOA meetings, and even tried to fine half the neighborhood for disrespect. But no one cared anymore. Neighbors laughed at their emails. Meetings were ignored. Fines went unpaid. Their empire of fear had collapsed, and then came the final blow. 2 weeks later, the HOA held an election for board members. For years, the sisters had run unopposed, their control cemented by intimidation. But this time was different. A group of neighbors led by Mrs. Patel and Alex stepped forward, rallying the community to vote them out. The election was crowded, the room buzzing with energy. The Karens arrived dressed in their finest suits, ready to claw their way back to power. But when the votes were counted, the result was undeniable. The sisters were out. The neighborhood had chosen new leaders, people who actually listened, people who wanted peace instead of control. The announcement was met with cheers, clapping, even hugs. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive, free. The sisters sat in stunned silence, their faces pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. I didn't clap. I didn't cheer. I simply stood in the back of the room, arms crossed, a quiet smile on my face. Because this wasn't just their defeat, it was the community's victory. Everyone had found their voice. Everyone had finally stood up. That night, I walked home under the glow of steady streetlights, my repaired solar panels humming above me, stronger than ever. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if the whole block had been released from chains. The Karens' houses, once symbols of fear, now sat in silence, dark and empty. Rumors swirled that they were planning to move away, to find another neighborhood to rule. But it didn't matter anymore. They were finished here. As I sat on my porch, sipping coffee under the steady glow of my porch light, I thought back to the moment I found my panels shattered, to the anger that had burned inside me. They had tried to take away my freedom, my pride. But in the end, they had handed me something greater: the chance to remind everyone what real power was. It wasn't in rules, fines, or fear. It was in unity, in neighbors standing together, in knowing that no matter how loud someone shouts, they only hold power if you let them. The Karen sisters learned that lesson the hard way. Then, as the neighborhood thrived in its newfound freedom, I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the sun's warmth wash over me. My panels would keep shining, and so would we. The war was over, and we had won.